And so we've seen this, return of the strong gods in the form of Donald Trump, but also in Elon Musk. Warts and all with Trump, he's done certain things that I think express a kind of audacity that only an American president could pull off.
So Michael Shellenberger recently shared his honest opinion of the Trump administration and Trump himself, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how Trump has shifted American politics and American culture, whether we like him or not. He also gets into how the elites of society have been forced to deal with Trump and the Trump phenomenon, and what we can take away from that in regard to the future of American politics. Shellenberger is one of the greatest American journalists in the world as far as I'm concerned, so let's see what he has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Michael, what is the pathology of our elites?
I think some context is important. So, we're at the end of an important political cycle that was not a 4-year cycle or even a 10-year cycle, but really an 80-year cycle. We came out of World War II. The United States and Europe had this open society vision that I think was quite healthy. It was trying to push back against the dysfunctional nationalism that had led to 2 world wars. But, as time went on, it became just too extreme. The open society dogma became this idea of kind of homogenizing all cultures, exaggerated levels of integration. You can see mass migration without real consideration of how to assimilate folks or what the impact would be on other unskilled, citizen labor. So I would say the pathology of our elites had to do with really the classic pathology of civilizations in decline, I'm afraid, which is the elites start to identify with elites in other countries more than with their own working class. And also then the elites start to import other workers, and they start to identify with other workers from other countries, ostensibly in the name of empathy and compassion, but in reality as a way to kind of keep the working class down, to maintain status for themselves, for elites in the society to essentially live, like feudal nobility with a whole servant class.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with him here, especially regarding the behavior of the elites, which seem to be having more kinship with elites in other countries than with their fellow Americans. And we can see this with globalist organizations like the WEF and the UN. And we don't need that kind of centralized power above even the dangers of centralized government in the United States. He's largely right about integration. With the integration of lots of people, it also brought the centralization of government. And that's the biggest problem in my mind. The progressive era forward, brought us the income tax and the Federal Reserve and the military industrial complex and endless empire building schemes and the surveillance state and an ever-growing police state. And now we have, the fascist combination of corporate power with government power, where government, gets away with what it would always desire to do on its own by using corporate entities as proxies to do that. That's what Palantir is trying to get away with now, to aggregate more data on us and expand the surveillance state. So mostly agree with them here.
From around the world. So I think that's at the heart of it, is just a kind of decline of solidarity by elites with their fellow countrymen.
And what are the consequences of that? What does it mean to live in a nation where the elites feel more allegiance to their elites across continents than to the people living down the street from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really corrosive. So I think we see it most dramatically in the mass migration, which, we actually do the best job in the United States of assimilation. I think it's been much more difficult for Europe to do it, both because of the kind of cultures that exist here. Ours is heavily an immigrant culture already. In Europe, they have their own traditions. Plus, I just think they're bringing, it's a large Muslim population that's being brought to the European Union. The United States, has traditionally been a Catholic, Christian population with a different set of values that are more, I think, aligned with Western civilization. So mass migration has been a big part of it. I think we've seen the rise of this digital censorship complex, or Digital Services Act is what it's called, but it's really a Digital Censorship Act, a real intolerance of any different points of view, particularly nationalist or populist views, in favor of really imposing the official woke globalist dogma that I think we're all familiar with. So it's really, I think that the term for it is sometimes given as anarcho-tyranny, that on the one hand, it's, anarchic on the streets, there's increasing lawlessness, there's the grooming gangs in Great Britain, which is one of the most shocking, sex abuse scandals in recent history. And at the same time, it's tyrannical, and you have small groups of experts operating out of Brussels that think they should decide what the truth is and decide what kind of information the masses are allowed to be exposed to.
Yeah, on one part of that, I have to really disagree with him. There's nothing anarchic about these policies. Government is growing in these countries, including the ones he's talking about, the United States and Britain. Government's not shrinking or becoming anarchic by any stretch of the imagination. If it was, my job would be done, and we have a voluntarist society. We don't. We have an ever-growing police state, ever-growing military-industrial complex. What he said about migration, I think, is largely true. I don't think migration itself is innately wrong, but ever since aspiring politicians, realize that if you import cultures from other countries en masse, you can change the culture of the country that you're importing them into. So mass migration has essentially become a government program. I'm not so sure that there's that many easy answers to that, but I do think it's not centralizing all control over immigration into a central entity in Washington, D.C. that's maintained full plenary support on an assumption of all powers related to immigration since the 1875 Page Act. Since then, it's the central government essentially calling the shots, and, regardless of the president in power, it doesn't seem to have shifted that much. There were several ebbs and flows. Reagan had an amnesty. Clinton pretended to really, crack down on border security to an extent he probably did, but now it's just being used as a mechanism to assist people in trying to shift the demographics and voting trends of Americans, so to speak. But I would like to see, instead of mass migration, mass cloistering, mass fragmentation, balkanization, a kind of national divorce that allows people to have more sovereignty over their societies rather than kicking up everything to Washington, D.C. And, if you doubt that, that's fine. But, if you are untrustworthy of globalist entities, you should be more relatively untrustworthy of entities that are more relatively globalist, like Washington, D.C., compared to your local community or your local state or your local region.
Right. We have drugged up homeless fighting with machetes on the streets of Austin, Texas. Meanwhile, we have censors in the EU telling us what we can and cannot say.
Right. In some sense, I think one of the ways to think about it is the society is disordered. The elites are disordered. You're getting kind of boundary violations. Things are in the wrong place. So you see a breakdown of the traditional fences, as Chesterton described it, that protect society. So, on the gender ideology, you see the traditional protections for children are undermined, and the idea of changing their bodies to affirm really an imagined identity. We see the actual borders between countries being eroded. We see, efforts to basically not enforce laws, undermining, basic laws. So you see all of these essential offenses, structures, foundations, whatever else you want to call them, of Western civilization coming under attack by the elites, particularly by the left elites, but really the whole elite class in general.
Yeah, there's certainly selective law enforcement. I'd be happy if a lot of laws weren't enforced or weren't followed, specifically, like the income tax, or the fact that the U.S. is going to establish a Federal Reserve or give the president power to essentially wage wars on his own. That was the War Powers Act to an extent. I would like to see those laws not enforced, but it's not those laws that they don't enforce. It's the laws that are inconvenient to the elite class that they don't enforce. It's all selective. They make excuses for it. But, we could do a lot better if it really was the most egregious laws among those that linger on the books in the swamp. But we won't get that because of how the elite class operates.
And so Nietzsche has this parable of the madman, which I love. And I keep thinking of it as I read your work lately, because when Nietzsche's madman lights a lantern in the bright morning hours, he cries that we've killed God. We are his murderers. All of us are his murderers. But the madman is mad. The morning is bright. And I wonder sometimes if there are a few brave voices like yours who have been calling our attention to the rise of the total state for a long time now, but there haven't been nearly enough voices calling our attention to what's happening. And in America right now, there's this sort of weariness tied with hope, if that makes any sense, where we're so excited about the vibe shift that I'm personally tired of the negative headlines. We want something to be hopeful in.
Yes.
And so I wonder, as someone who's been calling our attention to mass censorship for so long, how hopeful should we be? If you've been giving us these warnings for a while now, and they've perhaps fallen on too many deaf ears, can we still be hopeful about what's next?
I mean, I think it's important to remember that, the future is still being created. It's being created by us. So I think if you go into the future, if you look forward with an overly pessimistic attitude, you're not going to be able to...
You've already lost.
Yeah, you've already given up.
Right.
So you have to have some positive vision. Look, I think, we saw a huge political revolution in the United States. I mean, it's extraordinary what's happened. And I certainly have my own problems with President Trump and my own criticisms. But what he's done on certain issues has really been quite transformative. Just in the last few days, and many people know that I've been big advocate for free speech, not just in the United States, but around the world, here in Europe, but also in Brazil, where I'm under criminal investigation for the Twitter Files Brazil. When, pro-democracy advocates, pro-free speech advocates went to President Trump and they said, we need to put financial sanctions on this particular Supreme Court justice who's really one of the bad actors. Trump's response was, we'll do 50% tariffs instead. He is more audacious than the advocates in many of these spaces. And the result of those tariffs, I think, is that Brazil is going to have to change its policies. In fact, we've already seen the Supreme Court now is divided. This is all happening in the last 48 hours. The Supreme Court is starting to become divided. You see President Lula is starting to soften his tone. Look, the United States remains the global hegemon, I think, not just in the West, but globally. And so when the United States says we're going to put 50% tariffs on Brazil, even accepting the orange juice and airline business, which are these two big businesses, it's powerful. And so that gives me a lot of hope.
Not me. I mean, I have to disagree with him here. I agree with him in regard to his honest and earnest viewpoints towards censorship. And when other countries do it, it doesn't absolve them from wrongdoing. But I still want to trade with Brazil for the same reason I still want to trade with Cuba and China. It doesn't make sense to punish American consumers for that. And that's what tariffs do. So it's a mistake to say you're putting tariffs on other countries. What that means is you're taxing Americans more for foreign goods from those countries. It's a penalty against the American taxpayer in the same way that the income tax is a penalty toward the American taxpayer just when it comes to income. So I don't completely agree with him as far as the best policy prognosis here, but he's totally right about the censorship regime, and Trump has transformed American politics in many ways. Populism is probably more prevalent than ever on the right, and I think that's a generally good thing. Now, there are some duplicitous things toward Trump when he talks a big game regarding that, and you see this societal change, this culture shift a little bit, but he still employs the same kind of foreign policy that we've seen from the neocons, despite how much the neocons, have dragged this country through the dirt. We see the starting of a new war in Iran, the rearming of Ukraine for over 8 months, not abated by anything. Doesn't look like the recent agreement will pan out to be a peace agreement because Trump isn't willing to do what it takes to do that, to ramp up wars in Yemen and Syria in his first term, ramp up bombing in Afghanistan in his first term. This is just an example.
Similarly with Europe, and we saw J.D. Vance come to Munich, I believe back in January. Gave a great speech saying the real threat to Europe is not from Russia or China, it's from within, it's the totalitarianism from within. So on the one hand, I think Nietzsche is obviously the person that did the most to draw attention to the fact that the Enlightenment, represented by the light in that parable, killed God in the sense that it really undermined traditional Christian faith, is what he was writing about. But I think that Nietzsche also, he was a huge fan of Emerson. I just visited the Nietzsche house. I didn't quite appreciate how much he appreciated Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson was an American, and America is fundamentally different from Europe in so many ways. It is a place that nurtures constant creation and recreation. And so we've seen this, return of the strong gods in the form of Donald Trump, but also in Elon Musk. You see it in a variety of contexts. I think the United States coming back and saying, no, the center of power is no longer in Europe, and it's in the United States, and we're going to start demanding that the light of freedom, shine once again. And I think that is the thing I have the most hope for. Warts and all with Trump, he's done certain things that I think express a kind of audacity that only an American president could pull off.
Yeah, and in most ways, I agree with how he ended that. J.D. Vance's speech to Europe, was a great speech, I will say. He warned about the issues of censorship, not in China or Russian, but one from within, from the European Union and from America. But then, this administration, this Trump administration, has, forced censorship laws when it comes to people that are critical of Israel. Various states have rewritten their codes to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and it's improper, it's absurd, and it's downright hypocritical if your view is that censorship is wrong. And this Trump administration, I hate to say, supports that. And they, are part of a lobby that's pushed states like Georgia and I believe Arizona, maybe a few more, to rewrite their hate speech laws and adopt new hate speech laws to accommodate this. It's the same kind of, wokeness that we saw on the left, just directed only towards anti-Israel sentiment. And that's what we're seeing here. But I am with Vance when he said that speech that the main threat to us and our liberty isn't from China and Russia. It is from within. The government is the entity that's siphoning away our liberty, our freedom, and our wealth far more than any of the CIA's latest boogeyman and the countries that are foreign that they all warn you about. The government's biggest job in its propaganda apparatus is to try to lead you to the belief that all the woes that you have in your society, the things that are bringing you down, treating you unfairly, etc., are from foreign entities, but they're not. They're from your own government. But I don't think that the Trump administration has followed that line of logic to its fullest conclusion, clearly. Now, I think he's also right that Nietzsche talked about, the death of God. And sometimes people, especially a lot of atheists, act like that was some triumphant thing, like this was a great thing for humanity. But Nietzsche was actually arguing the contrary. He was arguing that since, mankind is a religious people, and when you kind of take away their religious precepts, you've killed God, that's what he was talking about there, they'll fill it with a different kind of religion. And how that manifests is going to be utterly destructive in comparison to the religions that they had known prior to that. And I think he was right. He foreshadowed the total state, the rise of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, the destructive Holocaust and the purges, Mao's Great Leap Forward and the Holodomor and Stalin's military purges. All that was foreseen because those were the new religions. Those were the religions of the total state. And that still has a grip on people, I hate to say, even when it comes to the COVID regime. In a way that the COVID regime was a religion. Fauci was a patron saint, and the baptismal rite was getting the vaccine. And, part of good works was telling the unvaccinated that they were the problem. There were so many elements of this that were likened to a religion in many ways that, it's impossible not to notice it if you pay attention to these things. But great conversation. I appreciated it. Some things to agree or and disagree with Shellenberger. I think he's fantastic, very thoughtful guy. As I said, one of the greatest American journalists in the world right now. I think he's more inclined to support this administration generally than I am, but there's no arguing the fact that Trump has changed American politics and culture quite a bit. But I do want to hear from you down below. Let me know, do you agree with Shellenberger? Do you think that he's off on some things? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to the University of Austin. Thanks for hosting this. And please consider becoming a YouTube member of mine. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel, and in return, I will give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.